Ah, the 1970s, platform shoes, disco fever, and a peanut farmer in the Oval Office. Yes, we're talking about James Earl Carter Jr., the 39th President of the United States. Picture this, a serene Georgia pond, the sun glinting off the water, and President Jimmy Carter all set for a peaceful day of fishing. Little did he know he was about to become the star of a news story that would hop its way into the annals of presidential history. Our story takes place in the spring of 1979. Carter, with his folksy charm and promises of integrity, had swept into office just a few years prior. But even presidents need a break, and Carter, like many before him, sought solace in the tranquility of his home state, Georgia. Now you might be thinking, what could be so scandalous about a fishing trip? Well, dear viewer, this was no ordinary fishing trip. This was the day Jimmy Carter came face to face with a foe unlike any he'd encountered in the political arena, a swamp rabbit. Yes, you heard that right, a swamp rabbit. The story goes something like this. Carter was enjoying the peace and quiet of the pond when suddenly a furry torpedo broke the surface of the water. It was a swamp rabbit, and it was heading straight for the presidential fishing boat. This rabbit, according to some accounts, was hissing menacingly, its teeth flashing and nostrils flared. The date was April 20th, 1979. President Jimmy Carter, clad in his finest fishing attire, was enjoying a peaceful day on a pond in Plains, Georgia. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the fish, well, let's just say they weren't biting. Little did Carter know his luck was about to change, though perhaps not in the way he'd hoped. As he cast his line into the water, a shadow emerged from the depths, but this was no ordinary fish. Plains, Georgia, isn't exactly known for its Loch Ness monster sightings. This was swamp rabbit territory. These creatures, known for their impressive swimming abilities, are a common sight in the area. They're also, for the most part, harmless herbivores, more interested in munching on water lilies than terrorizing world leaders. But on this particular day, something was different. This rabbit, for reasons unknown, had developed a peculiar interest in presidential fishing vessels. As the rabbit approached the boat, Carter, being a man of action, sprang into, well, let's call it defensive mode. Accounts of the incident vary, but what we do know is this. The President of the United States, leader of the free world, found himself in a rather undignified standoff with a wet rodent. Some say he splashed water at the creature with his paddle, attempting to shoo it away like an overzealous house pet. Others claim he delivered a swift presidential whack, sending the rabbit hopping back to the safety of the reeds. Whatever the case, the Great Rabbit Encounter of 1979 was over almost as quickly as it began. The rabbit, perhaps realizing it had misjudged the situation, retreated to the safety of the swamp. Carter, no doubt slightly embarrassed by the whole ordeal, resumed his fishing, albeit with a newfound wariness of the water. Unbeknownst to Carter, a White House photographer had been present during the entire ordeal, and thus a picture was snapped, a picture that would soon become the stuff of legend. Now, I say legend because, frankly, the photo itself is a bit underwhelming. It shows Carter in his boat, looking slightly perturbed with a blurry shape in the water that could be a rabbit, a log, or perhaps a particularly large clump of algae. Now, to truly appreciate the absurdity of the killer rabbit incident, we need to rewind a bit and consider the state of American politics in the late 1970s. Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer from Georgia, had ridden into office on a wave of optimism. He promised honesty, transparency, and a return to normalcy after the tumultuous Nixon years. But as the decade wore on, Carter's presidency seemed to be plagued by a series of unfortunate events. The economy was sputtering, inflation was soaring, and the Iranian hostage crisis had cast a dark cloud over the nation. Carter, despite his best efforts, was struggling to connect with the American people. Little did they know that escapism would come in the form of a very unlikely antagonist, a swamp rabbit. The shadow of Watergate loomed large over Carter's presidency. The American people had lost faith in their government, and Carter, despite his promises of a more ethical and transparent administration, struggled to shake off the cynicism that had taken root. The killer rabbit incident, though seemingly trivial, played into a larger narrative of presidential competence, or lack thereof. Here was the leader of the free world, seemingly losing a battle of wits with a semi-aquatic rodent. The media, always eager for a good story, pounced on the incident, portraying Carter as out of his depth, both literally and figuratively. It was a classic case of a small story taking on a life of its own, fueled by political opportunism and a public hungry for a distraction from the more pressing issues of the day. The late 1970s were a time of great uncertainty and division in the United States. The Vietnam War had left deep scars on the national psyche, and the Watergate scandal had eroded public trust in government. The economy was in shambles, with high inflation and unemployment rates causing widespread anxiety. The malaise that Carter spoke of was palpable. The American dream seemed to be slipping away, and people were looking for someone or something to blame. In this context, the killer rabbit incident, though absurd, became a symbol of the perceived incompetence and weakness of the Carter administration. Now, you might think a story about a president fending off a semi-aquatic rodent wouldn't exactly set the news cycle on fire. But this was 1979, my friends, a simpler time when news traveled at a slightly slower pace, and a good animal anecdote, especially one involving the leader of the free world, could capture the imagination of a nation. The story, as these things often do, began to spread. First, it was whispered in the halls of the White House, then shared over cocktails at Washington, D.C. soirees. Before long, the tale of Carter's swamp rabbit encounter had reached the ears of the press. And let's be honest, journalists, bless their ink-stained souls, have always had a nose for a good story, even if it means adding a bit of embellishment here and there. The swamp rabbit quickly morphed into the killer rabbit, a ferocious beast with a taste for presidential toes. Headlines screamed of the attack, painting a picture of a president under siege by a relentless furry foe. The Washington Post, never one to miss an opportunity for a good pun, ran with the headline, "Bunny Goes Bugs Rabbit Attacks President." The accompanying illustration, a parody of the Jaws movie poster featuring a menacing rabbit with razor-sharp teeth emerging from the depths. Subtlety was clearly not on the menu that day. The New York Times, while slightly more restrained, couldn't resist the allure of a good animal attacks president story, publishing an article titled "A Tale of Carter and the Killer Rabbit." It was a media feeding frenzy, fueled by a potent cocktail of slow news days, political satire, and the undeniable absurdity of the whole situation. Adding to the absurdity, the White House, for reasons that remain shrouded in mystery, or perhaps just a healthy dose of common sense, refused to release the now infamous photo of the incident. This, of course, only served to further pique the public's curiosity. What did this fearsome beast look like? Was it the size of a small bear, as some reports suggested? Did it have glowing red eyes and drool that could melt steel? The lack of a clear image only fueled the media's imagination. Newspapers and magazines ran with artists' renditions of the killer rabbit, each more outlandish than the last. The killer rabbit became a blank canvas onto which the media could project its own interpretations, biases, and of course its insatiable appetite for a good story. Imagine you're President Carter. You're grappling with a global energy crisis, a hostage situation in Iran, and an increasingly skeptical electorate. And suddenly the biggest story in the nation is your close encounter with a swamp rabbit. One can only imagine the frustration, the disbelief, the sheer "are you kidding me" moment that must have washed over the Carter administration as the killer rabbit narrative spiraled out of control. Initially, the White House seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. Deny the incident? That would make them look even more ridiculous. Embrace it? That would only add fuel to the media firestorm. In the end, they opted for a rather awkward middle ground, attempting to downplay the incident while simultaneously acknowledging its existence. Jody Powell, Carter's ever-loyal press secretary, found himself in the unenviable position of having to explain the killer rabbit incident to a skeptical public. It was just a rabbit, he insisted, with the weary tone of a man who had suddenly found himself cast as the straight man in a surreal comedy sketch. The president was not attacked. There was no chase scene. No one was injured, except perhaps for the rabbit's pride. But the more the White House tried to downplay the incident, the more the media seemed determined to milk it for all it was worth. The refusal to release the photo only added to the intrigue. The speculation was endless, and the White House's attempts at damage control seemed only to make matters worse. The American public, as you might expect, had a field day with the killer rabbit incident. Late-night talk show hosts had a wealth of new material. Newspaper cartoonists sketched outlandish depictions of the encounter. Even the venerable Walter Cronkite couldn't resist cracking a smile as he reported on the bunny attack from his anchor desk. But beneath the laughter and the ridicule, there was also a sense of sympathy for Carter. Here was a man clearly trying his best in a difficult job, only to be tripped up by a swimming rodent. The killer rabbit incident, in a strange way, humanized Carter, revealing him to be not just the leader of the free world, but also a slightly hapless soul who occasionally found himself in over his head. The killer rabbit incident, though undeniably humorous, took on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of the perceived failings of the Carter administration. Critics, both within and outside of Carter's own party, used the incident to paint him as weak, indecisive, and out of touch. It was a narrative that, unfortunately for Carter, resonated with a public already disillusioned by economic woes and the ongoing Iranian hostage crisis. Political cartoonists, always eager to seize on a good visual metaphor, had a field day with the killer rabbit incident. The message was clear. Carter was ill-equipped to handle the challenges facing the nation, and even a seemingly harmless creature like a swamp rabbit could get the better of him. The killer rabbit incident, though largely forgotten by the general public, has become a part of presidential lore, a quirky footnote in the history books. It's a reminder that even the most powerful person in the world can be humbled by the unexpected, and that sometimes the smallest of creatures can leave the biggest of marks. Carter, to his credit, seems to have taken the whole killer rabbit saga in stride. In the years since leaving office, he has occasionally referenced the incident with humor, acknowledging its absurdity while also defending his actions. "I was just trying to protect myself," he once quipped. "It was a big rabbit." The 1980 presidential election saw Carter facing off against Ronald Reagan, a former actor, who projected an aura of strength and optimism that Carter, after the tumultuous events of his presidency, simply couldn't match. The killer rabbit incident, though a seemingly minor blip in the grand scheme of things, became a symbol of Carter's perceived weakness and inability to control the narrative. Reagan, with his folksy charm and his promise to make America great again, effectively capitalized on the public's desire for a leader who wouldn't back down from a fight, even if that fight involved a swamp rabbit. The killer rabbit incident, though never explicitly mentioned by Reagan on the campaign trail, became a silent but potent symbol of the choice facing voters. A president who splashed at bunnies, or a president who would stare down America's enemies, both foreign and furry. So, there you have it, the killer rabbit attack of 1979, a tale as bizarre and frankly as American as apple pie, baseball, and, well, panicking over a slightly damp bunny. It's a story that perfectly encapsulates the often absurd intersection of politics, media, and good old-fashioned wildlife encounters. Jimmy Carter, a man who navigated the complexities of international diplomacy, found himself forever linked to a swamp rabbit with a penchant for aquatic adventures. The incident, though often played for laughs, serves as a reminder that perception is everything, especially in the world of politics. A president already grappling with a myriad of challenges can be undone by the smallest of creatures, or at least by the media's portrayal of said creature. The killer rabbit became a symbol, however unfair, of a presidency seemingly adrift, a metaphor for a nation struggling to find its footing in a time of uncertainty. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the killer rabbit incident is its sheer absurdity. It's a story that reminds us not to take ourselves or our elected officials too seriously. After all, in the grand tapestry of history, sometimes it's the seemingly insignificant moments, the ones that make us laugh, scratch our heads and say, "Did that really happen?" That leave the most lasting impression. And so, the tale of Jimmy Carter and the killer rabbit lives on, a quirky footnote in the annals of American history, a testament to the enduring power of a good story, even if that story involves a slightly grumpy swamp rabbit and a very surprised president.